Hello.
Hi.
I'm Rabbi Harvey Dr. Bolofsky. I am the senior rabbi of the Golders Green Synagogue, and I am the chief consultant and rabbinic head of University Jewish Chaplaincy. But today, I am chairing a panel of illustrious friends from a multi-faith group that I want to tell you about. Last year, March of the Living UK, which I'll tell you more in a moment, ran a groundbreaking programme which involved these three wonderful people who I'm going to introduce in a moment, and a number of others. And we spent 5 quite unforgettable days together in Poland. March of the Living UK, you can see a little poster in the background. It takes hundreds of people each year, mostly students, but others as well, on a full experience to Jewish Poland in the past, during the Holocaust, and Jewish life subsequently, to expose people, mostly Jews, although there are an increasing number of non-Jews, to an extraordinary period of Jewish history, a very dark period, and some extraordinary things that happened before and after as well. Last year, after many years of this wonderful programme, which is run by Scott Saunders, the founder, and the fantastic Cassie, and many, many other volunteers and professionals who create the most wonderful programme. Last year, as an experiment, I was given the opportunity to curate a multi-faith leaders group. That means we put together, with the help of funders and backers, a group of extraordinary leaders, people who are really game changers in their field and their communities from across different faith communities. And we went together with a carefully curated programme which incorporated the March of the Living itself on Yom HaShoah exactly a year ago. And we had a wonderful time. It was enriching, developmental, and we're going to spend a little time together now exploring how that was for some of the participants, reminiscing, taking some questions. It was my privilege to curate that group and to co-lead it with Richard Verber, a remarkable educator. And we were able to go not just to death camps and places of terrible suffering, but places where Jewish life had been successful for 1,000 years in Poland, to learn together, to discover what it means to look at a heritage through the eyes of someone from a different faith, and also to think a little bit about post-war Judaism, particularly in Poland. But what I'd like to do now is to let you know that we're going to have some questions, which I'm going to put to our panel, whom I'm going to introduce in a moment. And when we've done that, there will be an opportunity, I hope, at the end for questions. If you would like to send a question in, please comment on the March of the Living UK live stream page, and this question will be forwarded and selected ones will be sent to me for questioning for our panel. So thank you very much for joining us wherever you are. If you're in the UK, it's the middle of the afternoon. If you're further east, it's going towards evening. And if you're in the States, it's the morning, or even perhaps even earlier than the morning. Thank you wherever you are for joining us. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have 3 panelists, all of whom were participants in last year's programme, activists of great significance and influence in their own communities. I live in this rather interesting space between curating the trip, co-leading it, although I'm not a Holocaust educator, and also being a participant. I work as a rabbi of a large Jewish community in Golders Green in northwest London, and I work in campus. I'm a consultant to various organisations. I'm a broadcaster, and I also have a number of interests in various other areas in the Jewish community, including in the interfaith world. But that's enough from me, and I'd now like to introduce the 3 other panelists. I'm going to ask each of them to say their name, although I will probably say their name first, and offer to begin a 2-minute reflection on why you heard my call, were willing to take 5 days out of your busy schedule to join me and our other colleagues on March of the Living UK's multi-faith trip to Poland in 2019. We have with us the Reverend Margaret Cave, Ramona Ali and Jasvir Singh, now all dear friends. And I'm going to begin with Margaret. Please, a 2-minute reflection, a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and why you decided to join us last year.
Yeah, thank you, Harvey. Well, I have to say it's been one of the most extraordinary privileges of my life, not just going on the March of the Living trip last year, but getting to know Harvey and the other people that we went on the bus with. We were part of Bus H, which we obviously had to call the Holy Bus, because we were all holy in our own ways from our own faith communities. And when Harvey asked me, well over a year in advance, I'd never heard of March of the Living. I obviously knew quite a lot about the Holocaust, but I'd never heard of March of the Living, and it struck me as an extraordinary experience. And I didn't hesitate to say yes to joining the trip. And I knew, and as it drew closer more and more, what an emotionally and physically grueling trip that it was going to be. And it was all of those things, but it was also the most incredibly privileged, rewarding and extraordinary, life-changing trip. One of the most amazing things that I've ever been privileged to participate in. So I'm extraordinarily grateful to Harvey, to Scott Saunders, and all the people who made it possible for us to do that. And of course, being part of this interfaith group made it a really different experience. I think one of the things that I was looking forward to, and which made a real difference, was that we were all able to share things from our own perspective, which enriched the trip, enriched everything that we discovered about the Jewish life in the past, the Jewish experience through the Second World War and the events of the Holocaust, and the hope that's being found now in the resurgence of Jewish life in Poland today. So it was an extraordinary visit in terms of time, in terms of the people that we were with, and in terms of experience of our own faiths together with people of other faiths. And I certainly for me, it was a trip that meant that I grew in the strength of my own faith as I shared with others in their faiths. I was supposed to say where I come from, so I better go back to quickly say that I'm a Church of England priest. I'm currently working as the team rector in East Greenwich in London, and so I have the O2 in my parish. I'm the area dean of my local Church of England deanery, and play a part in the interfaith world and in some other aspects of life in the Church of England and my local and London-wide communities. Okay.
Margaret, thank you so much for that. Could I now hand over to Jasvir?
Hi, I'm Jasvir Singh. I'm the chair of City Sikhs. I'm also the co-vice chair of the Faith Forum for London. And when Harvey got in touch with me, I simply couldn't say no. As a member of the Sikh community, we have experienced awful times in our past. And in fact, there are two periods of time within the 18th century where there are references made to the greater Holocaust and the lesser Holocaust. So as a Sikh, I felt it was important for me to go to the March of the Living, to partake in that experience and to see just how impactful it would be. Obviously, as a student during my GCSEs and my A-levels, I learned a lot about the Holocaust. But being there in person was perhaps one of the most, it had such a supreme impact on my own identity as someone who's Sikh, as somebody who works within the interfaith circles, but also as a human. So one of the things which really stood out for me during that trip was being at Auschwitz, being at the place where many of us have seen images over the years, which are notoriously iconic, if I can put it in those terms. But being there in person, being at the railway tracks, was perhaps one of the most moving moments that I've had, not just during the trip, but in my life. Just thinking about the trains, the carriages arriving one after the other with individuals who had been living their lives happily, who now found themselves in a situation where they knew that they were going to be killed. And it was horrific, but also quite bizarrely, it was quite life affirming to see the sense of celebration, the fact that the march that was now emerging was that of the living, those who celebrate the fact that they were not, that the faith continues to exist, that the Holocaust did not get rid of an entire swathe of humanity. It killed a numerous amount of people, but hope survives. And I think it was that message of hope that really resonated with me as I left. And obviously, being in the company of so many people who I consider to be good friends of mine now, it was a wonderful experience. It really was.
Jasvia, thank you very much. And I'm delighted now to move and introduce Ramona.
Hello, thank you. I don't know if there was a reason I went last. Might have been a wise move. So when Rabbi Harvey asked me to go on this trip, actually, when he asked me to do anything, I can never say no. And this was something that I could only say yes to, in a relationship that I've had with Judaism and the Jewish communities for a really long time now. So when I was like, I think 11 or 12 years old, I chose to do a project on Judaism. And there was this old book that we had in the house. I think it was probably printed in the 70s. And it talked about like Jewish practices and rituals. And so I was really drawn to it. And I wanted to kind of explore Judaism more. And then when I was at school, I was older, and I remember I did history, GCSE, and I just remember there was this picture in the book, in the history textbook, and it was like a grainy black and white photo of two young schoolboys, and they were hanging their heads, lowered in shame because they were being humiliated for who they were, and it really impacted me. That photograph, I still think about that photograph now. And later on, in like about 9 years ago, I did a campaign on Muslim-Jewish solidarity between Muslims and Jews, and focused mainly on World War II and the Albanians who rescued Jews from the Nazis. So I've always felt a closeness, and I wanted to step further into the experience of the Jewish people and into the pain of the Shoah in particular with this trip. Because I honestly, genuinely believe that when you share someone else's pain, it just brings you closer together in a very genuine way. And I wanted to feel that deeper sense of empathy, and that definitely happened on this trip that we went on with March of the Living last year. And I was so grateful to be with a gang of God botherers, with the people who I consider friends, and wonderful people from different faiths. And I think that really, really helped. I obviously forgot to say a little bit about myself at the beginning. So I'm, if you probably guessed, I'm a Muslim journalist, and I write for publications like The Guardian, and I do some BBC radio work, and my focus is on faith and lifestyle and identity. So on this trip.
Ramona, Jasvia, Margaret, thank you very much. It reminds me and inspires me that we were able to put together a group of a dozen, of whom these are three excellent examples of the highest caliber influencers in their communities. And that I think are fortunate that in each case we hit absolutely the right and made absolutely the right choices, because not only have each of you really inspired each other and me, but I think that you've been the people who have gone back to your communities or worlds and really made an impact. More of that shortly. But I want, before we go to that, to ask you the following, and we'll do it in a different order now, because I know that Ramona doesn't like being last, so we're not going to have her last this time. Is that it's a year on. In fact, today is Yom HaShoah. Today would have been the march, if it were not for the current health crisis, would have been the march itself this afternoon in Auschwitz. So it's exactly a year since we were together, and therefore kind of ending our extraordinary trip. So a year on, it's amazing to feel that the year has passed, and we've all had many memories, some painful, some happy, I think some motivational. So I would like to hear from you. If you had to choose one memory of the trip that's inspired you or you've thought about most? What is it? Perhaps I could ask Jasvir first to comment on this. One memory from last year, that you've carried forward.
I think the memory that I've carried forward is one which really struck me as a Sikh, and it's to do whilst we were in the museum, and whilst we were looking at some of the artifacts of those who had gone to Auschwitz, who had been brutally killed there, and it was just seeing the mounds of hair. Now, as a Sikh, I don't cut my hair. I've never cut my hair. My hair has never been cut since I was a child, since birth. So for me to go into that space and to see the hair that's been collected of the victims of the Shoah, of those all collected and placed in a single area, in a single room, and given the reverence that it has been, was deeply moving, but also quite frightening. It really brought to home the impact of what had happened so many years ago, so many decades ago. And that's been my lasting memory, the idea of the hair, the importance of hair within the Sikh faith, but also seeing the way that the hair has been preserved as quite a thoughtful reminder of what's happened, but also being treated with the deepest of respect. I think that's really stuck by me.
Jasvir, thank you. Ramona, sorry that Margaret, that does leave you last, but I imagine our friendship is strong enough to survive that. So Ramona, if you could dwell on one
that I go.
thought.
Oh, I'm not very good at obeying rules. I find it really hard to choose one. Every single moment was memorable. Like meeting Eric Hirsch, the survivor, and his wife Jean was just like, honestly, it really made such a huge impact on me. That was amazing meeting them, going to the cemetery, going to the community center, literally everything. But I'm going to pick out, can I pick out three? I don't know. I'll pick out one.
Ramona,
there was a time where we were looking at.
Ramona, the way this works is that because we enjoy a particular relationship, our family with you, we'll allow you three as long as they're brief.
You're very kind, thank you. So there was a time when we were looking at there was a wall of pictures, and it was just gazing at this gallery of images that were intimate portraits of family life, and it really made you think that beyond the abstract numbers, that you could feel these people's lives, their relationships, there's pictures of sisters together, of families together, and that really brought home the loss, the absolute profound, deep loss of people and individual personalities. That really affected me. Another time was when we were walking under the infamous sign at the entrance to Auschwitz together, linked arm in arm. And that was captured really beautifully, actually, by the photographer, Sam Churchill. And it was just that moment of singing and being linked in arm in such a place of devastation that it was a defiance, and an act of defiance, and also an act of survival and existence. And that really was an important moment for me. There's the photograph. Yeah. So that was a powerful moment. And another moment was placing our plaques in the tracks at Auschwitz. And there were people who came over to me who just said, thank you for being here. And I was like, please don't thank me. I should be here. This is what I'm meant to be doing. But that was an extraordinary experience of meeting other young Jewish people, older Jewish people, and just like being together and sharing those moments together. That was really important.
Ramona, thank you. And before I share my own reflection, Margaret. We can't hear you, Margaret, that's it.
Okay, great. All the things that both Jasvir and Ramona have mentioned are very powerful memories for me too. But one that I particularly stands out for me is that when we visited the death camp Belzec, I think that's how you say it, we went through the narrow entrance and got to the bit, and it was raining that day. It was a very, very wet day, and somehow that felt an appropriate weather for the place and for the occasion. And we walked down the narrow entrance and came to the place where up on the wall is the verse from Job chapter 16 verse 18, which says, "Earth, do not cover my blood, let there be no resting place for my outcry." And it's there in English and in Hebrew, and below it are like scratches in the rock, which could be blood, could be tears, could be the gouges that people made with their nails in their last moments in the walls of the places that they were confined to. And as we stood there in the pouring rain, one of the rabbis who was with us sang the Holocaust memorial prayer. Harvey will have to tell me how to pronounce it properly. It's God full of compassion. Is it El Mali Rachamim? Something like that.
That's really pretty good, Margaret. We'll give you that. Thank you.
Thank you. And it was just extraordinarily powerful. We all entered into that moment together as a shared moment of deep compassion. And I'm pretty sure that all of us had tears flowing in that moment. So there were moments of real togetherness in the suffering and the struggle, but there were also, if I'm allowed a little extra memory as well, real moments of hope in that shared sort of kind of solidarity of pain and grief. And Arik, who was the survivor who journeyed with us for one day, he shared with us a lot of his experience in Auschwitz-Belsen. And one of the things that he said, and I'll never forget, literally sitting at his feet, looking up at him speaking and showing us his tattooed number and talking about the experience of being there. He said that when they were there wasn't one single blade of grass. And when we visit now, when we were there this time last year, there's lots of grass. And actually, when the days that we went to Belsen and Auschwitz, it was sunny as well. And there was lots of grass. And the contrast, I think, between that experience of being there at a time of sort of real greyness when there wasn't a blade of grass, and the hope of being there now, placing the memorial plaques, something about the contrast, and that gave hope, I think, of the fact that there is grass there now and there is hope for the future.
Margaret, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. I think one of my remarkable memories, having been to, I think, all the places that we visited together last year before, is the possibility to share the experience and gain such different perspectives. These places are always dreadful, and I think however many times I have the privilege of visiting them, they're going to be raw, awful, painful, beyond belief. And some of the specific memories, particularly about the children's graves and going to Buzek, which Margaret mentioned, are uppermost in my mind as well. But what is even more so is what it means to be able to go and visit sites which are generally understood to be a very specific, in particular cases, specific Jewish interest, and gain the perspective of those with very strong connection to other faiths, different perspectives, to broaden, perhaps in some cases, to challenge one's own perceptions. And those things have carried me forward very strongly over the last year. As well as having made some extraordinary relationships. Some of the participants were dear friends before, but became closer, and some were people I scarcely knew, but had become very firm friends, and those relationships have been formed through the harshest of experiences, but nonetheless, I think, have a particular life of their own, which is hard to describe. I do also remember the song. Here's a disclosure. I did suggest to Marta that we attempted to sing the song but I'm informed that the kind of technology won't quite stand it. We'll all be out of tune or out with each other. So we're not going to do that. You'll be pleased to hear. But I do think the prospect of singing together and sharing that experience and sort of praying for the well-being and injecting, as Jasvir said, a little hope also stands with me, particularly currently where there is so much suffering, although be it of an entirely different nature. Moments of hope in difficult times, I think, are very important to all of us. So I'd like to move on to another question. I certainly feel transformed by the trip, and I think about it often. And we had planned to run a second group this year with another carefully curated group of extraordinary high caliber multi-faith influencers. Unfortunately, due to the circumstance, we're not able to go in person this year. Please God, we'll be able to go later in the year at some other time with the new group, and I hope some of the new group are watching and participating in this and thinking about what we could have been doing this week, even though it hasn't worked out for now. But certainly I feel changed by the trip. And when it came to Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, towards the end of September, when it's customary to kind of think back over the year, I certainly have felt that this was one of the most worthwhile things I did last year in terms of my own development and perhaps making some kind of contribution. That's a very general question, but I'd like to ask each of you, Margaret, Jasvir and Ramona, this time I'd like to ask Ramona to go first. What did you take back into your own life, world, community? Answer the question as you like, which has perhaps enabled you to influence others. Ramona.
Well, I have been incredibly affected by the trip. I don't think I've ever cried that much in my life in those 5 days. Like, my tear ducts were literally utilized to the max. And it affected me so deeply that it actually also gave me more resolve and more determination to stand against anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred. So it's actually opened up a lot of discussions between my family, my friends, wider communities about my experiences, because I feel like I've really stepped inside those experiences in a very profound way. So there is emotional investment, complete emotional investment now. And so I feel like there's more kind of gravitas to the words that I use when I'm speaking to people or to whenever I write about this. And it's important that we didn't leave our experiences there, that we bring them back with us to the people around us, to our own communities, because obviously there is still anti-Semitism that exists in our world today, which is a deep shame, but something that we now need to also take on the challenge of fighting against. So for me, it's made me more deeply aware of the trauma and the pain of the Holocaust, and it's made me just even more determined to fight against it.
Thank you, Ramona. Margaret?
I think one of the things that's most profoundly influenced me, and I hope has led to me influencing others in the same way, is that I think that I discovered really profoundly, deeply, and afresh, if you like, that we can find God in the face of terrible suffering. And that sounds a bit of an upside down thing, because it was. And like Ramona, I wept, and we shared this pain of the terrible way that human beings had behaved towards one another. And it's profoundly, deeply disturbing and life-changing to experience that in such a kind of real and kind of graphic way. But together, and the solidarity of being there as people of different faiths really, really profoundly took me to a deeper place in my own faith, and of that discovery that I really could find God, and that others could find God, and that people who were there in the moment had found God in the face of the most profound suffering. And at the same time, I think, like Ramona, you get a new sense of determination not to be a bystander. But I was also profoundly challenged, and our educator here, who Harvey's already referred to, the very amazing Richard Verber asked us to consider when we went to the very beautiful forest, beautiful when we visited, but the place where about 10,000 people, Jewish people and others, were shot and buried in mass graves, that when we were there, we were asked to consider if we'd been those very ordinary policemen from Hamburg who'd been asked to kill those people, would we have been able to say no? And I think I was profoundly challenged by the reality of it's easy to say I don't want to be a bystander, because of course we don't want to be a bystander, but the reality of actually being brave enough not to be a bystander it's maybe more difficult than we'd like it to be, but it's given me a new resolve, but also made me appreciate the challenges.
Thank you, Margaret. And Jasvir, how have you been changed by the trip? What do you take back to your world?
It's changed my outlook on the world of interfaith, actually. It's very easy to be working on social projects, to work together with people of other faiths and other communities. And you find yourself in a bubble sometimes. You find yourself surrounded by individuals who all share the same thoughts, same ideas or concepts of bringing people together in that sort of environment. But it's important to also understand the lived experience of others and of those faiths. And being on the March of the Living last year, being as part of the interfaith delegation, gave me that insight to how the Jewish community suffered appallingly in the last few, over the last millennia or so. We went to the Poland Museum, and whilst we were there, we learned about the extensive history of the Jewish community in Poland. We learned so much about how pogroms and various other discrimination has taken place over years gone by. But then we saw it culminate in the atrocities that were committed during the Shoah. And understanding the context, seeing how a community had survived to some extent side by side, to some extent well integrated in a part of Europe, and for that to disintegrate completely within the space of a few years was it was eye-opening. And I think it's also reminded me that it's very easy for us to become complacent in life, complacent as to how our society is, and to be that bystander, as Margaret was just saying. It's a very easy position to take, but as soon as you understand the context and the background to very, very difficult periods of history, such as this has allowed us to do, it then opens one's eyes up to how we can work together in a more holistic manner. So, for example, talking about genocide and genocidal riots, and bringing together the experiences of other faith communities, but talking about them collectively in such a way that we can understand, but truly understand, the impact of what happened over 70, 80 years ago.
Thank you very much to all of you for your insights on this one. Here is another question, which is related, which is that all of you have explained eloquently why you came, the impact on you, what you've taken back, and perhaps how you've been changed. Certainly, we experienced a very intense few days together. We've all indicated it was life-changing, and I know this will be the case for all the others with whom we've all remained in contact. We shared difficult experiences, and we created friendships. Which kind of relationship, you don't necessarily have to mention the person by name, what kind of relationship, a new friendship or a new professional collaboration arose from the trip that you find that you're particularly fond of, or you feel has been especially important to you over the last year? Perhaps I could ask Margaret to go first with this one.
Mention Talia, our bus leader, who was, I think, a little reluctant when asked I know she was a little reluctant when she was first asked to lead the Interfaith Leaders bus, but was completely converted by us. So thanks for being converted, Talia, to knowing what a great thing it is to work across the different faiths, and for being such a great bus leader. But Talia shared with us that when she was actually at Auschwitz with us leading our group that day, this time last year, she heard from members of her family for the first time that she had relatives who had died at Auschwitz, and was able to find their names in those big memorial books at Auschwitz. And so when it came to the today and the opportunity to put the plaques on the railway track with everyone else, a few of us all of us on the bus were able to say to Talia, you know, a lot of us, well, those of us who weren't Jewish anyway, we don't have relatives that we can write their names. Can we write some of the names of your relatives on our plaques and put them on the track? And that was a really kind of profound thing for us to be able to do. And I know for Talia, and she's written very movingly about it, and I know she's watching now because she's just put up a photograph of us on screen on our holy, our Bus H Holy bus group. So I know she's with us. And Talia, you shared something very profound about what that meant to you, but it meant an enormous amount to us as well. So I think those sort of things about being able to share very deeply in shared memories and reflections, and that doesn't just stop on the trip, that continues on. We've been able to meet and share as a group since then, but it's also has an ongoing impact on our other relationships. And Harvey and I were privileged to take part in a seminar about Jewish Christian relationships earlier this year. And I think on the back of what we've been, the profundity of what we'd done last year, we were able to be really much more honest about the real difficulties than we might have been in different circumstances. So I think it has ongoing impact in all sorts of ways.
I'm just going to interject before asking the others. First of all, I'm very pleased you gave Talia a shout out. Talia was the logistics person who effectively held everything together. Within half an hour of her departure from the bus, because she left separately, we couldn't find the food, we couldn't find the cutlery, we had no idea where we were going. And so it's an opportunity to thank Talia, because people have great ideas. We are extremely fortunate to have a visionary leader in Scott Saunders, March of the Living International, together with the local program, were able to fund the project. These are all people who are willing to run it, take time off. We have Richard. Without Talia, the thing wouldn't have run at all. So thank you to all of those involved. And we hope that when we run future trips, that Talia will be willing to overcome her squeamishness about these sorts of things and be with us again. I think that I'd just like to validate what Margaret said. I have been thinking earlier today about our recent encounter at Southwark Cathedral, and how there are some genuine difficulties about bringing faiths together. One can create friendships, but there are some hard edges that are not easy to navigate. And having experienced a trip of this sort with such intensity and built trust in unusual ways, I think it does make it easier, at least to be honest with each other, particularly when we don't agree. So I'm very grateful for that. And it's an opportunity to shout out for someone who's a mentor of all of ours, the wonderful Chris Raval, who was one of the participants in last year's trip. He hasn't been well. We know that he's recovering and wish him well. But this idea about learning to deepen relationships so that we can disagree more effectively, disagree better, as it were, comes from him, and something for which we are all very grateful. So with that interjection and various shout outs, Ramona? About friendship.
Yeah, I want to shout out everyone. Yeah, Talia for giving her Chris to me as well, sharing her Chris. We're all sharing food and emotions throughout the entire trip. Also again, like Richard Verber, who I have known before, but I literally reached a new level of respect for him. He's an incredible educator, and also Helise Lieberman, who helped us, incredibly along that entire journey, and really conveyed sentiments in such an incredibly powerful way. I'm really indebted to them for bringing that experience so close and so powerfully palpable. I thought that was, so they were wonderful. And just to everybody on the trip, the vicars, the revs, the rabbis. I would not have been able to do it without the entire multi-faith group. I mean, I knew most of them before I went on the trip, and I counted them as friends, but there was also some people I didn't know so well, like Reverend Charlotte Bannister Parker, who's unwell at the moment, and this is why she couldn't make today. But I didn't know, I'd never met her before, and there were moments throughout the days where she kind of saw me flagging and run over and literally physically hold me up, and that was really touching. So I don't think I could have done that trip without Jasper, without Margaret, without everybody. And I think that we carried each other through, and our different faiths, our different faith perspectives really gave an important texture to the overall experience. We listened to each other's processing of that, and sometimes we questioned together things. We'd find our own ways of kind of processing it all. So it was an important aspect of the trip that it was a multi-faith experience.
Thank you. And Jasvia, could we ask you to say a few words on the same theme? Thank you. Oh.
To everyone who was involved in the trip, it was I think it's very difficult to just name individuals because everyone played such an important role within that trip. And I think we all consolidated quite well as a result of our visit. We've had, and again, as Ramona said, I knew many of the people, most of the people that I was on the trip with, but being on the trip meant that I got to know them better rather than simply faces I would see at various interfaith events or through various projects that I'm involved in. I got to know them. I got to know more about their families. I got to know more about their inner thoughts and their concerns about the world as it currently is. And I think it's that ability to have been able to share so openly with each other about our own lives, about the lives of those around us, and doing that in the context of an interfaith delegation visiting Poland and being part of the commemorations for Shoah. I think it was very, it was a fascinating trip. I don't think it's something that I could ever do again, but it's something that I will never forget. And I'll never forget, certainly, all the friendships that have emerged from it as a result.
We are fairly near the end of the time, but I'm going to now ask, I think, two questions. Please don't feel you all have to answer them. I think two questions. The first is, we've already heard how each of you were able to find ways to share your experience with others and influence the worlds and the circles and your networks within which you operate. Could you each share perhaps a brief idea about an innovative way or a particular vehicle that you found helpful for sharing the stories of what you'd seen within your own communities or social networks? Raise your hand if you'd like to speak. I see. Oh, Margaret, thank you. Thank you for saving me.
To unmute me. Thank you. I think that the telling this, what this reminds me of, which I think is really important in all faiths, is telling stories. And what brought alive the amazing experience of the trip was hearing each other's stories, and that was of the people that were in our bus group, but also hearing the stories of people. We went on a journey. Richard, our educator, took with us Helena Birkenbaum, who's a young woman who survived 3 different concentration camps, and she, going on that journey with her, hearing excerpts of her journey at the actual places where they took place, really brought it alive. So hearing Eric Hirsch, the survivor who was actually with us in person, telling his story, it just reminded me again about how telling stories is just so important. It's so important for us in every part of our lives, but particularly in our faith journeys, in telling stories that share about our faith and share about our understanding of God and share about our experience of God.
Thank you. Would either of the others like to comment on that? There's no need to, but would you like to? Ramona. She's muted.
Everyone's saying. I think I just wanted to comment on something that completely unexpected happened on the trip, when I was asked to speak at the ceremony, Yom HaShoah ceremony. But Richard asked me at midnight the night before, I think, and I was obviously petrified of doing that, but it actually turned out to be something that was really powerful, and it helped me to kind of think about, reflect on the days that we had spent together and all the sites that we had visited. And it was an extraordinary moment for me as a Muslim woman to speak at that ceremony. And it really did mean a lot, because I think it's pretty powerful when people from other faith traditions will enter your own tradition and just speak about it. And I was really privileged to be able to do that. And and I just kind of carried everyone else's experiences as well with me in my heart. And that really did help me kind of understand the impact of that journey. So yeah, that was just a reflection.
Thank you, Ramona. I'm going to ask a question which has just come in from someone who is watching this broadcast. A student who was part of the UK student delegation last year said that they were deeply and profoundly moved by the conversations with the survivor on their bus, and getting to hear her story. And it's clearly had a great deal of impact on the person who sent in the question. They've asked me to ask you, what is the most profound takeaway or something you particularly admired in your interaction with Eric Hirsch? Perhaps I could ask Jasvir from that, because I didn't give you a chance in the previous round, if you would like to take that.
Of course. I think it would actually be the conversation that Eric and his wife had, and speaking to his wife, who said that for many years, Eric simply didn't want to talk about what had happened to him, and the fact that he had suffered so brutally in the concentration camp, and the fact that once he did finally open up, that he just had so much to share, and he hasn't stopped sharing since. And I think that was very moving, because it made me realize obviously we know the phrases now, PTSD, the psychological impacts of what would have happened. But we always, certainly myself, I would always look at what had happened during the Second World War and during the Shoah as simply being a moment in history. And you forget to add the human dimension to it. And I think that's where Eric really added that human dimension, because he explained everything so vividly, being in one of the barns, one of the buildings, whilst he was speaking so eloquently about the awfulness of it all, the appalling nature of the treatment, the manner in which everyone slept during the very cold, long, cold nights during the winters. It brought it to life. And I think having that has meant that my understanding and appreciation of what happened many years ago is enhanced, greatly enhanced, by having had the opportunity to hear from him directly, but also understand that he himself continues to find it difficult, as of course he would. And I think that's been one of the most profound things for me to have walked away with, the understanding of the human impact and the continuing human impact of what happened during the Shoah.
Thank you. Would one of Margaret or Ramona also like to comment? Some of you already mentioned your interaction with Eric Hirsch and how it affected you. Would either of you like to kind of comment or add to what you've said already? raise your hand. Margaret, do you want to like to say something? I can't tell whether you're just smiling or whether you want to say something. Okay, please take her off mute.
Just to, yeah, there's something about meeting someone, and actually we also had the privilege to read his story, because Eric had written a book and we were able to get a copy from him on the bus, and I spent some of the bus journey reading his story. So I was reading what he'd written over the years, as well as hearing him in real life. And then when he was actually inside one of the bunkhouses at Auschwitz-Belsen, to hear him talk, he actually revealed and showed us his tattooed number on his arm at that point, and then walked over and actually touched the bunks where they'd had to sleep. And there's something really incredibly powerful about the actual presence in the place with the person that made the story not just a story, but an actual it just brought it to life in a way that you just can't. It's even difficult to capture, even on video or camera or anything. It was incredibly profound, and he was he is such a lovely, generous person, and so committed to telling his story so that it will make a difference in the world, and that that young people will hear that story, and that the world will be transformed.
Thank you. We have just 2 or 3 minutes remaining before we need to draw it to an end. If you have just each of you a 30-second thought, there are people watching and participating in this virtual Yom HaShoah program with March of the Living UK from all over the world. If you have just a few words, a parting thought about what you've seen, what you've experienced, but very briefly, so we can cover all of them in the remaining time. Just a final thought. Ramona?
Yes, I have so many thoughts, so many thoughts. It's been a year since we went on that trip, and I remember all of it as raw as if it was literally yesterday. Talking about Eric as well, everyone talking about Eric has, brought all those memories back to an extraordinary man, and his wife is wonderful and extraordinary too, Jean, who has been supporting him throughout this his recounting of his horrific stories. But he does it with such grace and such dignity and warmth, and and it was a real privilege to be able to spend some time with him and to be close to him. It really did affect all of us. That trip is something that I'll never forget. It's a trip I don't think any of us can ever forget. And it's important that we now move forward with it and use it in our work and in our speeches in any way possible to convey what we experienced and to bring the pain of the Shoah to today's audiences, because it's something that we can never forget, and that we need to we need to fight against any form of hatred that we face with today, because there's a growing threat of that hatred now. And for me, I'm just more determined, and I am resolved in carrying on those experiences with me forward into my career and to the communities around me.
Thank you.
So, I'm grateful.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to stop you, but I just would like the others just have a little chance to say goodbye so that we don't run into the next program. We're really sorry to cut you off, but thank you for those beautiful words. Jasver, just a few very brief final thoughts.
Of course, for me, it's about the fragility of life and being able to understand that we're very privileged in the world that we live in today. Regardless of the current circumstances that we find ourselves in as a society, we are very privileged. We should never take that for granted. We should never become complacent as a society. We should fight hatred wherever we see it. We should fight discrimination wherever it may arise. And hopefully we can remain the kind of society that we want to exist in.
Thank you very much. And Margaret?
Go back and say again that I think there's something really important about being prepared to go to a place, accepting the invitation to go to a place of experiencing or sharing the experience of what it's like to go through great suffering as a people and as individuals, and to face up to the terrible things that human beings are capable of doing to one another. And the enormous power of doing that as people of faith and discovering that we can find God in the face of such terrible acts and such deep and terrible suffering.
Thank you very much, and thank you for confining your words briefly, but very beautiful and powerful. It remains to me to wind up. I'm Rabbi Dr. Harvey Bolofsky. Our panellists have been Jasveer Singh, Margaret Cave and Ramona Ali. Thank you to March of the Living UK for proposing this idea and for inviting us. Thank you to Mashoa for hosting this. Thank you to the tech people making it happen, and thank you for everyone who's been involved. And thank you very much for those who are watching for joining us. And thank you for allowing us to share some memories of what is an unforgettable, life-changing trip. Thank you and have a good day.